Hey there, everyone, and welcome to the first class in our Plot Your 2022 and Plan Your Year Ahead training course. We're going to meet 3 times in this program, and the intention is to take a look at what's going on both in the sky in 2022 and in your chart. And I guess to clarify that, we're going to have a look at what's happening in the sky in 2022, but directly in relation to how it might be impacting your personal chart. So our focus here in this program is to help you connect with the cycles that are going to be most impactful and important for your chart personally in the year ahead. In today's class, our first class, we're going to go big picture and have a look at the outer planet transits, have a look at what Jupiter, Saturn, and the nodes are doing in the sky in 2022. And what that means is we're going to be taking a look at the degrees and the signs in the zodiac that they're activating, hopefully so you can start to put together a sense of what the transiting planets are going to be doing in terms of how they interact with your chart going forward. For those of you who are joining us on the live recording here, we do have Michael and Larry helping out with questions and chat. So if you do have a question as we're going, if you could please use the Q&A section. We do have a really big group, and keeping up with questions in the chat is going to be almost impossible. So if you want to chat amongst yourselves or share some of your own stories with some of the transits we're talking about, the chat box is going to be great. But if you have a question that you'd like addressed about the technique or about the transits, please use the Q&A box. Of course, if you're catching up with this video after the live broadcast, you can submit any questions you have via the online discussion forum. And we always, as always, have 2 live Q&A dedicated days. So our first live Q&A day is actually going to be this Thursday. There are 2 different live Q&As on Thursday, one at 9 a.m. Pacific and one at 3 p.m. Pacific. You can come to one or both. And if you can't make either, we will post the recordings of those in the class portal so you can catch up afterwards as always. So that is all the administration, I think, to make sure everything ends up in the right place so we can care for you as best we can through our time together today. So with all that said, let us dive in to our presentation. Here we go. So we'll start with one of my favorite quotes, and I do love this quote for timing. When you do things from your soul, you feel a river moving in you, a joy. And one thing it's important to keep in mind when we're doing timing in astrology is that we're not trying to look for things to worry about. We can do that, but that may not be the most useful application of working with astrology. Instead, what we're trying to do is to bring some curiosity to the different cycles or themes that may be emerging or unfolding in our charts. And our curiosity is about how might that show up? What might that indicate for me? Where might I be ready to go deeper or make some changes or coordinate some updates for myself in my life, in my experience in the year ahead? And this quote from Rumi, I find really helps me remember that time and moving through time is like traversing a river. And sometimes it's easy. There are kind of quiet spots where we catch a current and it seems to be quite smooth. And other points where we might feel like we're going through some rapids or over small waterfalls. And we've got to pay closer attention, keep our wits about us. And we might need to draw on some specific skills or talents or even resources. So when we are doing timing astrology, we're kind of dipping our hands or our minds into that river of time perspective to get a sense of what the currents look like as we go forward so that we can make sure we are looking in the right direction, we're preparing in ways that are going to be most supportive, and that we're at least open to what might be ahead of us. So that is kind of the intention that I'm going to take as we go forward. And I invite you to take a similar perspective. Every type of transit that you might be having next year, there is a good chance that somebody else has already had or has navigated through. And so part of the discussion forum online will be a great way to share some of our own stories. It's my belief that there's a way through just about everything that we come across. Sometimes it's a darker way through, sometimes it's a brighter way through, but sharing and connecting and a little bit of advanced insight are helpful to keep us kind of aware and mindful of whatever current or flow we're in at that particular point in time. Okay, so what I want to say, so the first part of today's class, we're going to look at the outer planet transits, and then we're going to dive into Jupiter, Saturn, and the nodes for 2022. So when we're talking about some of these really personal chart transits, what I need to say, so that you're not feeling like you're missing out on something, is that not everybody will have an outer planet transit in 2022. So not everybody has a Uranus transit every year. Not everybody has a Neptune or a Pluto transit every year. And so what we're going to do, one of my big goals to make sure you get today is that you know the hotspot degrees that the outer planet transits and even planets like Saturn and the nodes and Jupiter are activating, so that you can see what's hot and what's active in the sky in 2022. And then you can compare those hotspot degrees for 2022 with your personal birth chart, just to see what, if anything, might be activated and stirred up for you. In our second and third class, we're going to get more personal and take a look at your individual, annual, and monthly profections. So that's where you'll be able to get some of the more individualized cycles that apply to everybody. Everybody has an annual profection and a Time Lord for each year, and we'll go into defining what they are and what that looks like in class 2, but not everybody's going to have a Pluto transit for 2022. So I just wanted to make that really clear. It's okay if you don't, and you'll just be putting your energy and your attention elsewhere. So when we are doing predictive astrology, well, first of all, I personally think that in my experience, predictive astrology is the heart and soul of what I do. It's the majority of the kind of work that I share with clients. It's a huge part of my teaching practice. And so, as I mentioned in the intro, while it's great to be sort of forewarned is forearmed, there's a huge piece of understanding and working with predictive astrology that is about exploration and discovery. And I think there are ways that we can frame or experience cycles and transits in astrology that can help us grow, that can expand our experiences. Sometimes they are really inspiring. Sometimes they're kind of meaty and effortful, but these are the currents of our lives. And the one piece to keep in mind is that if you didn't know anything about astrology and you had no understanding of transits and cycles as they might affect your chart, you would still be experiencing the kind of events that you are going through. When we can add astrology into that mix, we get a framework or a perspective. We get a point of view about what's happening that can help give us context, that can help us find meaning or a sense of purpose in what we're dealing with, but can also provide a timeline that also makes our psyche, helps our psyche manage whatever's going on. Curiosity will be your biggest ally and your best skill to draw on when you have a look at timing astrology. So what might this mean? There are lots of textbooks and theories about how transits should show up, but I do think they have slightly unique iterations in each chart. So our theories are just our starting places, and bringing this level of mindful awareness or this deep open observation to your events when you're seeing events in your life through the lens of cycles in astrology is one of the best ways to really learn how timing in astrology works. So while our intention is to share lots of info with you today and over our next few classes together, you will continue to learn about timing in astrology in the year ahead as you live through the weeks and months where these cycles are engaging your chart and opening your heart. Okay, so with that in mind, we're kind of taking this perspective of how will you grow in 2022? Is there anything particular that you might be ready to let go of or release? Is there anything that you're ready to take on or start up? And so this is where the curiosity of what is 2022 about for me. So paying attention is really important here. What we're trying to do in this section is to define what makes your personal 2022 unique. So if you are going to have a Neptune transit or a Uranus transit or a nodal transit, that's going to frame something specific in your chart and your experiences in the year ahead. So with all of that said, let's dive straight in to some dates and details. We'll start with the outer planets, as I mentioned, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And so what we want to do here, what I've got on the screen here are the active degrees for each of these outer planets in 2022. I want to break this down a little bit further, but this is our starting point. So Uranus is going to start the year at around 10 degrees of Taurus. And the furthest forward into the sign of Taurus that Uranus is going to move this year will be up to 18 Taurus. And what that means is if you have any planets between 10 and 18 degrees of Taurus, as well as 10 and 18 degrees of any of the other fixed signs, which includes Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius, you're going to have a Uranus transit this year. Now, to break that down a little further, if you have planets between 10 and 14 degrees of Taurus or of any of those fixed signs, so between 10 and 14 degrees of Leo, Scorpio, or Aquarius, you're actually going to be having what's called the third hit or the third activation of your Uranus transit. So if your fixed sign planets are between 10 and 14 degrees of any of the fixed signs, you have already been having a Uranus transit since the middle part, maybe April, May, June of 2021. If you have planets between 15 and 18 degrees of Taurus or the other fixed signs, you're going to be starting a new Uranus transit cycle in 2022. So it's important to keep in mind, is this a Uranus transit that's just beginning? And that applies to planets or angles like your ascendant or midheaven between 15 and 18 degrees of the fixed signs. So is this a new Uranus transit starting? Or are you midstream? Are you mid-process with a Uranus transit that has been ongoing for more than 6 months and still has a few more months to run? So the dates or the numbers in brackets, I should say, represent the degrees that are new territory for this outer planet into 2022. So Uranus is going to cover from 10 to 18 Taurus, but the new part that Uranus is pushing into for the first time in 2022 is from 15 to 18 Taurus. Hopefully that piece is clear, but if you need any clarification, just let us know. Neptune is going to cover from 20 Pisces up to 25 Pisces this year. Same kind of concept. Neptune has been traveling through 20, 21, 22, and 23 Pisces already. So that is part of the sky that Neptune was activating in 2021. So if you have planets not just at 20 to 23 Pisces, but 20 to 23 degrees of Gemini, Virgo, or Sagittarius, the other mutable signs, you're mid-process with a Neptune transit that started back in that May-June period of 2021 and will continue for the first few months of 2022. If you have planets at 24 or 25 degrees of Pisces or any of those other mutable signs, Gemini, Virgo, or Sagittarius, you're starting a new Uranus transit this year. Sorry, Neptune transit, I should say, in 2022. So 24 and 25 degrees of Pisces or the mutable signs, they are the new active degrees for Neptune this year. So hopefully you're able to connect and see, what do I have in my chart? Is Uranus coming there? Is Neptune coming there? And of course, Pluto, the other big one. Pluto will cover from 26 to 28 Capricorn this year, 2022. Pluto has already been activating 26 degrees of Capricorn throughout 2021. So if you do have a planet or an angle around 26 degrees of both Capricorn or the other cardinal signs, Aries, Cancer, or Libra, you're just coming to the tail end of that particular Pluto transit. If you have planets or angles at 27 or 28 degrees of Capricorn or of any of the other cardinal signs, then you are going to be starting a new Pluto transit this year. We do have a few example charts that we'll dive into as we go through today. But at this point, I just want to make sure you're starting to make a connection between the degrees the outer planets are hitting and what might be going on in your chart. Now, some of you might be having no outer planet transit at all. Others of you might be having 2 or 3. You might be having multiple outer planet transits in 2022. This is all very normal and all a feature of how our unique birth charts are set up. I have some clients who are having 3 of these transits. I have some clients who are having none of these transits. So it's not so much about rating, what's better or worse, but more diving into what does this mean for my year ahead? And that's what I want to have a little look at now, to give you some keywords and concepts and take you through some of the processes about how to connect this to your chart. So the question that you want to reflect on, you can either do this now in class or you can do it afterwards in some of the worksheets that we'll be providing, is to have a look and see what, if any, planets or angles you have that are in the path of an outer planet in 2022. It's really important to remember those squares and oppositions from the outer planets. So even though we're focusing a lot on Uranus being in Taurus, just reminding yourself that it's also affecting planets at those same degrees in the other fixed signs, Leo, Scorpio, Aquarius. Neptune in Pisces, of course, is going to trigger planets that are at those same degrees in the other mutable signs, Gemini, Virgo, and Sag. And the outer planets with Pluto, 26 to 28 degrees, also triggering not just Capricorn, but Aries, Cancer, and Libra. So planets at those same degrees. Planets or angles. So the ascendant, midheaven, descendant, and IC are also important to consider here. So if you have any of your angles at those degrees, it is equally important for you to keep an eye on these pieces. The sextiles and trines from the outer planets are also important in that they will influence your chart and your life. So maybe if you're a little more advanced with your astrology, you're thinking, I don't have any planets in the fixed signs between 10 and 18 degrees where Uranus is activating, but maybe you have planets in those degrees in an earth or a water sign, and you might be getting a sextile or a trine from Uranus. Those types of transits are influential, but tend to be less dramatic. We won't cover a lot on them in class just for time purposes. But if you are know that you can include them if you want. But if you have choices between a sextile from an outer planet versus a square or an opposition or a conjunction from an outer planet, go with the more dramatic aspect, the square, conjunction, or opposition, because it is going to be stronger and more impactful in your chart. So for most of us, I think focusing on the conjunction, squares, or oppositions from the outer planets is key, but I know some of you are a little more advanced, and I wanted to briefly mention that. So just to help with visualizing, this is the chart just for the start of the calendar year, January 2022, and just taking an eye on those outer planets, Pluto, let me just move the video here, Neptune, and Uranus. So you can see where they're starting the year. Pluto is wrapping up being at 25 Capricorn. I didn't include that on the list because Pluto is at 25 Capricorn for just a few days, and then it's done with 25. So for all experiential intents and purposes, Pluto is going to activate 26, 27, and 28 Capricorn. And then that will make those aspect rays or energetic links out to those same degrees in the cardinal signs. Neptune starting the year at 20 Pisces and will move up to 25 Pisces. So you just want to kind of imagine that space in your chart, inserting Neptune in your chart from 20 to 25 degrees and Uranus from 10 to 18 degrees. And then just starting to explore what is that stirring or activating for you personally. Okay, and at this point, our primary focus is to think about how are these transits triggering your personal chart or the chart of an individual. So we're not so much trying to make a commentary on what this means globally for the year ahead, but rather the individual experience as described by your birth chart. So if you have a lot of fixed signed planets and Uranus is going to be an important transiting planet for you this year, here's a little bit of extra information. While the Uranus transit, the dates that are most important will be when transiting Uranus is at those exact degrees that match the degrees in your birth chart, whether it's your planets or angles. But in addition to that, we're going to see more of that slightly chaotic, stirred up, fast-paced type of energy of the Uranus transit taking hold when Mars joins Uranus by being in a fixed sign. And we'll see that in March, from late March to mid-April. I just want to double check that. Most of March, sorry, and then all the way through to the middle of April when Mars goes through Aquarius. So there'll be a sign-based connection from Mars in Aquarius to Uranus in Taurus, and that will kind of stir up and activate. It'll make things happen on the longer running Uranus transit you might be having. The Mars in Taurus transit, which happens later in the year, most of July and most of August, that is also going to further stimulate the longer running Uranus transit that you might be having. So just keeping those dates in mind can be helpful. So what to expect if you're having Uranus type transits? So there are some keywords and themes that may be helpful for you to reflect on, but also can be helpful for you to share with clients or friends or family that you might be talking to about their own transits. So we know that a Uranus transit is going to quicken things. Uranus is excitable, electric, energizing, and activating. Uranus tends to make things happen. So if you're dealing with a part of your life that has felt very stuck or very stagnant, maybe you have a planet at 17 degrees of Taurus or Leo, and you're feeling a bit restless or frustrated about that planet or that planet's topics in your chart, we know that Uranus is going to help you shake things up. Uranus likes to create change that leads to freedom. And so any Uranus transit that you might be having coming up this year is an invitation for you to do things differently, to make different choices, to consider how you might step away from restrictive routines or responsibilities, how you might unleash something that is authentic and real for you, even if it surprises those around you. So when we're in a Uranus transit, we know that things are a little unpredictable and unsettled, that we are in a heightened period of fast-paced change and development. We're growing and evolving quicker than normal. And that's usually going to mean we need some external changes in our lives to make space for the new you that is awakening or wanting to emerge. So the other thing that Uranus transits can do is create these unusual situations where exceptions or one-off type possibilities occur. So that could be something like, you might not normally be able to be considered for this study opportunity or work opportunity, but for whatever reason, exceptions or weird exemptions are being made while you're in your Uranus transit. So give it a shot because something that's normally not available might be. Authenticity is a word we hear a lot about with Uranus transits. And this is really about coming into a more full sense of not just who you are, but what's right for you in regards to the particular topics that Uranus might be activating. And you'll think about those topics in regards to the houses stirred up by any planets that Uranus is transiting. And the best way to kind of take you further into that is probably to show you an example. So let's bring up our first example chart today, which is for the singer Adele. And so we have got lots of transit activity in her chart for 2022. We can look at her chart if we have time later today for some of the other transits. But for this piece of our class and our learning, let's focus on the Uranus transits that she'll be having. Now, we've said that Uranus is going to move through 10 to 18 degrees of Taurus this year. And so that means Uranus is going to pass directly over Jupiter and the Sun in her chart, and that Uranus is also going to make a square to Mars in her chart. So they're all the planets that are in that 10 to 18 degree range in the fixed signs. Uranus will also be opposing Pluto for Adele. I don't tend to focus on outer to outer planet transits because they're more generational. And so you'll see me pretty much ignore that as we go. And that is more how I would work with clients as well. If you want to make a big focus of that in your own practice, you can, but I'm going to take you into the process that I use because I find it super helpful. So with Uranus going through that 10 to 18 degree part of Taurus, what I've done in my mind is sort of broken down the fact that Uranus will conjunct Jupiter, but I've reminded myself that that is going to be the third and final hit of Uranus to Jupiter for Adele. And that's because Uranus was activating 13 degrees of Taurus in 2021. It's still an important part of her experience. And if we were doing a whole chart year ahead reading for her for next year, I would definitely talk through that. Just to keep it concise and focused for our learning experience here, I'm going to kind of skip through to the sun part. We could do the Mars part as well, but just for time purposes, we'll focus on the sun. So Uranus conjunct the sun for 2022 for Adele. So there are some general themes we would talk about in terms of awakening to authenticity, discovering more about core identity, which are kind of common sun themes. But we'll take that further by bringing in the houses that the sun is influencing. This will include the 11th house in her chart where the sun is placed, as well as the second house where the sun sign of Leo is placed in her chart as well. So we could say that Uranus conjunct the sun is going to shift her identity, open her up, create a strong desire for freedom. She might be very restless. She might be reluctant to take on huge commitments or unable to for certain reasons. And this could be having an impact on friends, on social groups, on community connections. We could also see it's going to change things for her financially. The sun is a planet that rules the second house in this chart. And so this is a planet that represents money, cash flow, and income, as well as spending and saving habits. So we might expect some wild swings. Cash flow might be more erratic and less stable or consistent for Adele in 2022. Now, clients will often say, but is that bad or is that good? It's like, well, it depends where we're starting from. If we know that money is perhaps more likely to come in big chunks, we need to plan accordingly. If we don't kind of have that understanding and we get a big chunk and we think, well, we'll spend it all and worry about what's next, we might be left short. But if we know we get a big chunk and we might need to be kind of wise or thoughtful with that so that it'll tide us through any lull periods, then we can be better prepared. So this is what I mean by kind of going deeply into how the transit might be stirring and activating you. Keeping in mind that the sun, I know Michael always shares this beautiful phrase about the sun being the central organizing principle in our lives and in our charts. And I think any transits to the sun kind of shift what we're prioritizing and can kind of have this flow-on effect of the different ways we need to let the energy of Uranus kind of filter through into various parts of our lives. So that's just a few brief points about the Uranus-Sun transit coming up for Adele's chart. As I mentioned, we could have talked about Uranus-Jupiter, and we certainly could talk about Uranus-Mars. There are other transits as well, but just to get the lesson on the Uranus piece through, that's why we focused there for today. So yeah, somebody was just commenting about Adele doing a Vegas residency. She is doing a Vegas residency, but she's doing it a little differently where she's just doing weekends only for about 4 months from January to April. And I wondered if that was perhaps somewhat representative of the Uranus transit that she's having, where I'm not going to be doing this 4 or 5 nights a week. I just want to do it on the weekends. And at this stage, we're just doing it for a few months, and we'll see, you can see that that is perhaps more flexible than some of the typical Vegas residencies are. So we'll see how that unfolds for her as the year goes forward. That's also something new or different for her from a professional capacity. So connecting with fans, in a smaller setting. She's often played really large venues, and the Vegas residency is a smaller, more exclusive kind of venue. But it does give, weirdly, it can give some more consistency income wise, because she knows she's got to do the shows each weekend and then rely on them. So we could sort of see some of the 11th house, second house themes there. So watch that space for Adele heading into next year. So if we switch focus now to have a look at Neptune transits in 2022. So Neptune is covering from 20 to 25 degrees of Pisces, which will affect 20 to 25 degrees of all the mutable signs. I wanted to give a special mention to the month of April 2022 for any of you who are having Neptune transits this year, because of course we will also have Jupiter in Pisces with Neptune then. So Jupiter will go through that 20 to 25 degree part of Pisces in April, and that will really kind of enhance and develop and expand and bring into your awareness or to the forefront of your experiences the main themes of any Neptune transits that you're having this year. There's a real mix of qualities of energies that Neptune transits can kick in. In some of the more difficult expressions of a Neptune transit, we get things like tiredness, feeling worn out or overwhelmed. We might feel confused. We might struggle with decision making. So you might become less organized or less clear during a Neptune transit. While a Uranus transit is often an invitation to go faster and try new things, a Neptune transit is often a calling to slow down, to kind of let go, to surrender, and to, I would say that Neptune transits are a reminder that you are a human being rather than a human doing. And so when we're in a Neptune transit, the idea of doing less and just being more is really important. In its more positive iterations, Neptune transits can call us back to our soul or back to our heart, back to our feeling self. We can become more sensitive during a Neptune transit, and that can show up emotionally, where we start to feel things more deeply, and we might become a little bit more reflective or thoughtful about who we spend our time with or how many people we share ourselves with. The sensitivity of Neptune can also show up physically during a Neptune transit, where our body might become more sensitive. And that might mean we react to things that we didn't used to react to, or we might have to kind of purify some of our lifestyle habits or our eating protocols and things like that. Music and creativity and spiritual outlets and mystical or metaphysical pathways can be things that we reach for or crave during a Neptune transit. Qualities of kindness and compassion, most particularly directed towards the self, can be highlighted as well, where we need to kind of go gentle with ourselves. We need to be forgiving of ourselves, and we might need to manage that sort of quality of disappointment where we've hoped for something and now we're realizing it may or may not come together. Now, when we're dealing with big Neptune transits, slowing down is so, so important. If you've previously been someone who's always been on the go and juggled lots of things, you might find your ability to multitask is reduced during a Neptune transit. And so we're kind of reimagining a way forward that makes space for you to stay in touch with that soulful part of yourself rather than dismissing or denying it. And that can be a huge part of Neptune transits. There is often a desire to let go or to stop pushing or to stop fighting or to stop holding on. Like you're weary from trying to make something happen or come together, and you realize you need to just let it go and see how things flow. I do find that while all the outer planet transits have their own unique experiences and features, Neptune transits can be particularly tricky for people in modern life, because the way that Neptune wants you to kind of groove in this Neptune transit cycle is almost the opposite of what society and culture rewards or upholds as successful or productive. So sometimes we find ourselves having to push back on typical expectations, particularly around things like productivity in a Neptune transit. So I wanted to bring a client chart into this mix here as an example. So for those of you who are having Neptune active in your chart this year, keep in mind Neptune came up to 23 degrees of Pisces in the middle part of 2021, and we'll be back at this part of Pisces in 2022. Of course, Neptune is going to push forward to 24 and 25 degrees of Pisces, and that will affect planets around those degrees in the mutable signs. So this is an individual's chart who has Mars at 23 Pisces. So we're going to have Neptune go over that Mars again in 2022. And they also have Saturn at 23 Gemini. So Neptune at 25 or 23 Pisces is going to square that Saturn as well. So these are two different transits, but happening on the same timeline. And so we can interpret these based on Neptune conjunct Mars and Neptune square Saturn. And we can also bring in some of the topics ruled by those planets in the chart. So we know that Mars is typically a planet to do with energy, drive, assertiveness, being bold, and creating progress. We know that Mars in Pisces is going to have like a flow to its groove. And so Neptune conjunct Mars in Pisces is going to be a time of like perhaps losing energy or low drive or low enthusiasm, low motivation. So it's one of those kind of classic, yeah, we're going slower, we're not able to push, we're going to need more rest as we go. This is happening in the 6th house of health or illness, perhaps more accurately. And so there's certainly some things that we might talk about in terms of taking care of the body that might require a spiritual or an emotional healing component, but might also require some repair around how to boost one's energy levels, perhaps through diet or supplementation or exercise, given that Mars is connected to some of those things. Mars is also an important planet around two key topics in this chart. We'll stick with Mars just for time purposes today, rather than doing Mars and Saturn. And so Mars is also going to, the transit of Neptune to Mars will have an impact on relationships with other people, because we have one of Mars's sign of Aries on the 7th house. And the transit of Mars is also going to have an impact on finances here, because Mars's other sign of Scorpio is on the 2nd house cusp. So we could talk about needing to reduce pressure or expectations, perhaps around financial goals, or about how we might be able to show up for other people. There might also be qualities of letting go or vulnerability, getting into that kind of softer space in our relationships with others here as well. It could be there's an experience around needing to deal with the disappointment of thinking somebody else was a certain way and then realizing they're not. The other side of it is that if there is things inside this individual that might prevent them getting close to others, you know, we do see that natal Mars Saturn square, maybe some of the softening of the Neptune transit can allow some opening inside them that might create more of a flow with connections with other people. So we can kind of get a sense that things can go either way here. So just a quick look at how we can go forward into the chart with this Neptune awareness. So if we switch focus now to Pluto, so I do want to try and cover off all the outers as we go. Pluto, of course, activating 26, 27, and 28 degrees of Capricorn this year, 2022. Some of the active dates to keep an eye on will be when Mars is in a cardinal sign and interacting with Pluto, and that will intensify and amplify the obsession or the drive and determination of the Pluto transit. So that'll be February and early March when Mars is in Capricorn, as well as June and early July when Mars is in Aries. So for those of you who've had Pluto transits before, this will be no surprise. Pluto transits are going to be about intensity. We tend to get this compulsion of I need to figure this one thing in my life out, or I feel a bit obsessed about this particular area of life because certain things are going on and I have to give it all my attention or my best attention. So one way to describe a Pluto transit is like a narrowing of focus, where we go from being aware of a lot of things to just really deeply, almost like with a magnifying glass, going deeper and deeper into one or two particular topics. Now, those topics based on your Pluto transit will depend on the natal planet receiving the Pluto transit, as well as any houses ruled by that natal planet. There are going to be themes about power, about control, and often about wealth or money that are just naturally a part of Pluto transits. So regardless of where Pluto shows up, we can see ourselves having to deal with changing power dynamics. Do you feel that you've got more or less power or control around the topics of the planet that is receiving Pluto in your chart? Do you feel like you need to step into your power around the topics of that planet that is receiving the Pluto transit? One of the images I often use for Pluto transits is the idea of the caterpillar going into the chrysalis or the cocoon, and that the experience of being in a Pluto transit, the year that the Pluto transit is exact by degree, is like the time that you're inside that chrysalis or the cocoon. And the shift from the caterpillar's perspective, the caterpillar is just enjoying itself on the leaf, on the rose bush. There's a bit of sunshine, lots to munch on. And then they're in this cocoon, and all of a sudden life has shrunk down to this much more introspective, small space. And we do a lot of internal cathartic processing and healing while we're in a Pluto transit. It can be uncomfortable, but it has a purgative quality where we're able to expel things through the process, or as we get to the end of the Pluto transit, that have been congested or perhaps even have been toxic inside us. The phrase with the caterpillar and the butterfly is that, what the caterpillar calls the end, the butterfly calls the beginning. And one thing, as I've come to really reflect on that caterpillar, chrysalis, butterfly sort of process, is that while it does represent a type of transformation that's extreme or permanent, there is no going back for the butterfly. The caterpillar has gone. It has been turned into mush so that the butterfly can emerge. The butterfly comes out and it has a purpose. It is a pollinator. It has a primary role in nature or in a garden environment to help fertilize one thing and another. And so that when we come out of a Pluto transit, in the year after a Pluto transit has been exact in your chart, you are in that discovery phase of how will I be finding what my purpose is? What's the equivalent for you from that pollination of the butterfly? What is it that you learned, discovered, or uncovered through your own Pluto transit that you now want to share out or pass on as a message or a piece of insight or wisdom? So while the experience of being in a Pluto transit can be uncomfortable and certainly feel like our life shrinks down and we're really obsessively working almost in private on a couple of core things, the after Pluto transit process can have a sense of sharing the lesson learned. So keeping in mind, if you have planets or points at those sort of 25, 26, 27 degrees, we are dealing with Pluto stuff this year. So this is a client's chart who has Mars at the very tail end of Cancer, at 25 Cancer, and Pluto is going to make the final pass of that opposition to Mars in the very early part of 2022. Now, for this particular person, Mars is in the sixth house, so does speak to some of our physical health things. And Mars is the ruling planet of the midheaven in this chart. And so this is talking about a huge process of trying to find your power or your purpose where career and professional pathway is concerned. This person is kind of at the tail end of a needing to make a change with work and life direction. They've kind of been holding on because they've struggled with some of the letting go elements, but they're so close to being able to do that. To take another look at a different chart, I want to briefly bring in this chart of Roxane Gay, who has the IC in the chart at 27 Capricorn. So for the first time this year, we're going to have Pluto conjunct the IC for her. And I wanted to show an outer planet transit to an angle because they are so important. And Pluto on the IC is going to be about uncovering maybe secrets or hidden things in regards to family, family ancestry, or even your childhood. It's also about discovering some power through your living situation, your housing situation. For some people, this can be purchasing property or upgrading a home. Sometimes it's doing this kind of total gut renovation type experience, which is almost a physical expression of Pluto on the IC. So we can see how some of those Pluto concepts and keywords might show up around the topics of the angle in the chart. So that is something to keep in mind if Pluto is going over an angle for you this year. Okay, so that brings us to the conclusion of our outer planet section, and we will very shortly dive into the section on Jupiter, Saturn, and the nodes. So I just want to, there's one question here. I can see Larry's answering, which is great. And I just want to get it on the recording. Hans is asking, how much do we weigh the personal planet in aspect versus just considering how the outer planet would show up in the house topics ruled by that personal planet? So any planet in the natal chart is doing multiple things at once. It is representing itself and its core nature, but it is also in charge of managing the topics of the houses that it rules. And so you would certainly need to have a look at the houses ruled by the natal planet to get the full, complete, and holistic experience of what that transit might be stirring and activating in your chart. And the example used here is somebody who has Mercury at 23 Virgo. And so you do want to think about how Neptune opposing that planet is just going to affect Mercury things like communication, language, maybe your connection with technical devices or technology, but also how that's going to affect the topics of your Virgo and your Gemini houses in your chart. That's hugely important to keep in mind. Okay. So hopefully that's giving us a few pieces. I know we've got, I know this class prompts a lot of questions for everybody. And we do, of course, have Larry and Michael here helping out today. And if you've still got questions or you want to go deeper, we've got the live Q&A on Thursday where we can cover more questions there. So the switch at this point, we've looked at Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, which if you are having a Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto transit, it's going to be a very unique thing. It's going to be quite personal to your chart. It's going to be intense. These are outer planets that are beyond our direct ability to interact with. We need technology to see these planets. And so when these planets are transiting our chart, we do tend to have a little bit more of that dramatic, otherworldly type or out of this world type events or changes or experiences. And this can be as much as like those exciting breakthroughs and really pivotal growth points as it can be some of the challenges that they might represent. As we come into the realm of Jupiter, the nodes, and Saturn, we're now getting into transits that are a little more frequent. And so you're likely to be a little more familiar with them. So we'll be working with cycles here that are going to happen at different intervals throughout our lives. And so you may already have had a Jupiter transit to a planet in Pisces, for instance. And so you're going to have another iteration of that this year, but it might remind you of 12 years ago or 24 years ago, and so on. So the level of importance might be slightly different. So that's why we do the outer planet pieces first. But the kind of main piece of your year ahead does come from this Jupiter nodes and Saturn stuff, because we won't all be dealing with major outer planet transits, but most of us will have some Jupiter, Saturn, or nodal stuff going on in the next 12 months. There's kind of a qualitative difference. I wanted to just point that out. So as we look into 2022, Jupiter is a busy bee planet. Jupiter typically spends about 12 months in each sign, except when it's moving through Pisces. And Jupiter does go through Pisces a little more quickly than the other signs. And so Jupiter will be in Pisces from late December 2021 through to the early part of May 2022. So we've got about 4 and a bit months of Jupiter in Pisces. So we'll kind of get in strong with that, soak in what we can, and then we're straight into what Jupiter in Aries will be about. Jupiter moves into Aries in early May of 2022, and will spend most of the next 12 months from May of 2022 to May of 2023 in Aries. There is a small period of time from late October to mid-December of 2022 where Jupiter pops back into Pisces just briefly, but the bulk of our Jupiter and Pisces experience is going to be happening earlier in the year. We know that Jupiter is about growth and expansion, and I really think it's about developing new understanding, deepening your sense of how or why this part of your chart is important. And so we're going to be doing that in 2 parts of our lives this year. We're going to be doing it about Jupiter and Pisces, so the topics of your Pisces house, and also Jupiter and Aries, the topics of your Aries part of your chart. So that desire to say yes to new things is going to be filling us up in 2 different ways this year. With Jupiter and Pisces, we're going to be dealing with the healing, feeling, soul side of life. Jupiter and Pisces is going to be a chance to nourish our spirit, to really feed or nurture something intangible inside each of us. Jupiter in Aries is going to be about getting things done out in the world at large. And so there's a quieter quality to Jupiter while it's in Pisces. This is a wet sign, which is cooler and slower. And there is a more active, fast-paced quality to Jupiter once it gets to Aries. So it is important just to keep those little pieces in mind. But the primary way I use Jupiter when I'm looking for a year ahead trend is to have a look and see what transits Jupiter will make to any planets that you might have in Pisces or Aries. I do at a first look, and the way we'll teach in class is to focus on conjunctions from Jupiter and Pisces and Jupiter and Aries to planets or angles in your birth chart. You can certainly look at other aspects from Jupiter. Absolutely. We just won't have time to cover all of them in class today. The strongest type of aspect a planet will get from Jupiter will be that conjunction. And so that'll be why we focus on those. So if you've got planets in Pisces or in the very early part of Aries, you are getting ready to go big, and also to grow. The next piece we need to take a look at, though, are the nodes. As many of you know, the nodes are about to change signs. So in early 2022, January 18, I think, the true node, if that's the measure I'm using, and you might be using that too, the true nodes will change signs 18th of January 2022, North Node coming into Taurus, South Node coming into Scorpio. The nodes will spend about 18 months in the pair of signs that they're moving through. So we will all have North Node in Taurus, South Node in Scorpio for all of 2022 and for the first part of 2023. So we will be looking at conjunctions to the natal chart only. When we look at the nodes by transit, we're just looking, what do we have in Taurus and what is the North Node making a conjunction to? What do we have in Scorpio and what is the South Node making a conjunction to? So this is a heads up for anyone with Taurus or Scorpio planets or angles in their chart. We do have some nodal transit activity coming. Now, for all of us, Taurus and Scorpio represent a pair of houses and a set of topics that we're all going to be dealing with, those nodal feelings of being unsettled or agitated, the churning and the swirling. So if you're not sure what I mean, look back over the last 18 months to the Gemini and Sagittarius houses in your chart and just see how much of an unsettled, constantly changing and shifting vibe you've had in the Gemini Sag parts of your chart. Now that quality of the nodal churning, like imagining the oceans being stirred and stirred and stirred. That's kind of the quality that goes along with the nodal stuff. That's going to shift into the Taurus and Scorpio parts of our chart. So generally speaking, we're going to expect to start to feel some restlessness and some desire to kind of churn and move things around. Now, Taurus and Scorpio fixed signs. They don't like movement the way Gemini and Sag do. Gemini and Sag being mutable signs, like any mutable sign. You mentioned movement, and they're like, great, how much are we doing now? But fixed signs respond differently to movement activators, if you like. And so initially, you may be dealing with more resistance with the nodes coming into Taurus and Scorpio because they have an inbuilt kind of slower process. Now, the nodes operate slightly differently. And this will be important transit-wise if you have planets in Taurus versus planets in Scorpio. They're going to receive a different iteration or quality of energy. The North Node in Taurus has a quality of increase or overdoing it. The North Node can tend to excess. And so your ambitions around the Taurus parts of your chart are really intensified over this next 18 months. And you might be very ready to do more, to go big, to go all out around the topics of the Taurus part of your chart and your life. So in some ways, that can be rewarded because overdoing it in our modern society tends to be upheld or praised. But we do have to be a little careful that we might overdo it to the detriment of other areas in our life. So, with the North Node coming into Taurus, wanting more, wanting extra, wanting the next big thing, and then the next big thing around the topics of your Taurus house might mean that you neglect other parts of your chart and your life. The South Node is a completely different influence. It is about endings and letting go. It's a little bit like a leaky bucket where you're going to become very clear around the South Node in Scorpio nodal transit. You're going to become very clear what is a drain for you around the Scorpio part of your chart. What in your life is kind of depleting the topics of your Scorpio house sector. And over the next 18 months, you're going to be offloading or ending or letting go or downsizing or simplifying around the topics of your Scorpio house. So we want to get ready to release in the Scorpio parts of our chart. The other side of the South Node is that it does shift our perspective and priorities away from material goals, perhaps to do with money or security or stability, and onto things that feed that deeper soul or spiritual part inside us. So one of the words that comes up with the South Node, again, from the Indian traditions of astrology here around the South Node, is spiritualization. And so if you feel like you're not quite doing what's meaningful for you or what really has a sense of fulfillment and value for you around the topics of your Scorpio house, this South Node in Scorpio is going to help you get back on track with that core inner, maybe existential style stuff. It might mean you step away from worldly things that might be otherwise celebrated in society, but you're going towards what really matters and means something to you. So the nodes are increasing. As I've come to deepen my understanding of the nodes, I use them increasingly from a timing perspective. And so I wanted to include some information here today to help guide you and encourage you all to do that. Okay, so the nodes are a piece of what we want to think about for the year ahead. And of course, we also need to make sure we're paying attention still to the ongoing longer transit of Saturn in Aquarius. So Saturn does spend 2.5 years in a zodiac sign, give or take. And so in 2022, it's not a new vibe for Saturn because Saturn's in Aquarius in 2022 and it was there in 2021, but we're going further. We're pushing deeper into the Aquarius part of our chart. It is going to, Saturn, as we mentioned, is now going to, well, I haven't mentioned this yet, but we will very shortly. Saturn is going to activate the degrees from 11 to 25 Taurus. So we're now into the middle part of, Aquarius, 11 to 25 Aquarius. We're now into the middle part of Aquarius, and then a section in the last third as well. So if you have planets in early Aquarius or early fixed signs, like between 0 and 10, your Saturn transit is winding down. It's coming to a close, and you can kind of breathe a bit of a sigh of relief. You won't have to be putting in so much effort as we go forward. For those of us that have planets between 11 and 25 degrees of Aquarius or of any of the fixed signs, including your angles, like ascendant, descendant, midheaven, or IC, you're going to be starting a Saturn transit this year. Saturn transits are really important for bringing transitions and turning points. They act as like pivots to reflect and restructure. When we restructure something, we reorganize it. We make it a better form or format for our current experiences and priorities. So when you hear Saturn transits, or you know you're having a Saturn transit, I want you to think about it as an invitation to check in about your priorities and to shuffle your schedule so that your best energy and effort goes towards what's really important. Saturn transits are often about saying no or scaling back. They're about coming to the core or the heart of what really matters and starting to distance yourself or remove yourself from things that aren't directly supporting those top 1 or 2 priorities. We do have to do a level of work in a Saturn transit. And part of the things that can be uncomfortable with that for us is that Saturn transits ask us to clarify our boundaries and our limits. And many of us living in modern life in the 21st century, particularly in the wealthy Western part of the world, we sort of think that we can have anything. We don't like the idea of a boundary or a limit. We don't like the ability or the idea of not being able to do everything at once. And Saturn transits ask us to prioritize and to choose, to pick something over something else. And to the extent that you're comfortable choosing, you can make good headway and be very productive in a Saturn transit. But if making choices makes you feel uncomfortable, if you're worried about upsetting other people or letting people down, then Saturn transits can become a little trickier. So we have to choose one thing or another when we're in a Saturn transit. We also have to sequence or order things, and we have to say, I'm going to do this first and that thing later. And so if you do have a big Saturn transit coming up this year, I encourage you to make the choices that present themselves to you. The clearer you can be, the clearer you can create, the more clarity you can create for not just yourself, but for others around you. And that piece about clarity is one of the great gifts of any Saturn transit, is that you see things as they really are, rather than as you want them to be. And while sometimes we have to see or acknowledge things that we don't like, at least we have accepted or acknowledged the way they are, and we can move forward from there. I can obviously talk about Saturn transits and other transits for days, but let's go forward and get some of these dates and details up for you. Just going to move forward to this slide here. So Saturn is moving through 11 to 25 degrees Aquarius this year. And that means that there's a huge part of Aquarius Saturn is covering, but the new part is from 14 to 25 Aquarius. So Saturn has already come up to 13 Aquarius. That was its station degree in 2021. So if you have planets at 11, 12, or 13 degrees of Aquarius or the other fixed signs, you're just going to have your third and final Saturn transit in the early part of 2022. And then that'll be done. If you've got planets between 14 and 25 degrees of Aquarius or any of the other fixed signs, you're going to be starting a new Saturn transit this year. And you'll have at least 2 and probably 3 activations of that Saturn transit throughout the year. For those of you who have planets in Pisces or in the early part of Aries, so Jupiter is going to start the year at 0 Pisces, go all the way through Pisces, and in fact, come all the way up to 8 degrees of Aries. So if you have planets anywhere in Pisces, you're getting a Jupiter transit this year. And if you have planets in those first 8 degrees in Aries, you're also going to have a Jupiter transit this year. So be ready for opportunities, growth, or a few of those kind of celestial lucky breaks, or with Jupiter being in the right place at the right time can be sometimes how that transit will show up. The nodes are going to cover. Now, remember, the nodes move backwards through the zodiac. So they're going to come into Scorpio and Taurus at the end of the sign, 29 Taurus, 29 Scorpio. And then the nodes will move backwards to 11 degrees Taurus and Scorpio throughout this year. So if you have planets in, any of the sort of 2/3 of the signs of Taurus and Scorpio are being activated by the nodes this year. So if your planets are very early in Taurus and Scorpio, your nodal transit won't happen till 2023. But if you've got planets or even the angles in your chart, anywhere between 11 and 29 degrees of Taurus and Scorpio, you will have a nodal transit this year. So what I want you to do at this point, we're going to take a moment just to connect the houses. I know our planet placements are all so unique in our charts, but what I want you to do is just at this point in time, think about you're probably very familiar with the house that Saturn in Aquarius is going through, because we've been doing that for a little while. So take a moment to check out the Pisces part of your chart, the Aries part of your chart, where we're going to have some Jupiter activity, and then the Taurus and Scorpio parts of your chart, where we will have the nodal activation. Many of you will have seen the house diagram on the screen here, but if not, it's a basic reference to some of the core themes for each house. Of course, there's so much more detail and nuance for the houses in the chart than we can include on one diagram, but it'll at least be a starting point. So when you're doing a year ahead consult for yourself or for others, particularly with Jupiter and the nodes changing signs a little bit more frequently, it can be helpful to simply talk about their impact on the house that they're moving through, using some of the keywords that we've talked about and that are on the slides here. But the most personal part of a Jupiter transit or a nodal transit or a Saturn transit is, of course, when those transiting bodies interact directly with planets or angles in your birth chart. And so if you have a choice, definitely skip to the direct interaction in your own chart piece. So we have covered a huge amount of theory and info so far. We've looked at lots of dates and details, and certainly a few keywords and concepts about some of the main cycles that are, or I would say the major transits that we can expect to be navigating for ourselves and to guide our friends and family and clients through in the year ahead. What I want to do at this point is just to kind of organize and review what we've been talking about, and then share a couple of chart examples as to how we might work with this. I know we've covered a lot of info today, and that was intentional in our first class, knowing that we've got plenty of time over the next few weeks to digest it all and to guide you through applying all of this material. Okay, so let's have a little look at that. So what we're going to do now, what we've talked about so far, is the transiting things, the moving bodies in the sky that are going to be active in 2022. And we've looked at which particular parts of the zodiac they're stirring. And the second piece is then to connect that to your own birth chart. And this is where looking at your personal planets or your natal chart and your angles, we kind of tie the timing stuff into the natal. So here's what I want to have a look at. So if you have coming up this year, if any of the outer planets, which include Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto, if the degrees that they're covering in the sky this year means they will make a conjunction, a square, or an opposition to any of the visible or traditional planets in your chart, as well as the angles, that would be your number one type of transit event to discuss, to reflect on if it's just you looking at your own chart, or to discuss with a client or friend if you're looking at somebody else's chart. So this is one of what we call our VIP type transits, where we have an outer planet that's moving through the sky and making a conjunction, square, or opposition to one of the traditional or visible planets in your birth chart. So you could be having Uranus square the moon, or Neptune conjunct Mercury, or Pluto opposite Saturn. These would all be types of important transits to have a look at in terms of setting the theme and the tone for your year ahead. So that would be the first layer to have a look at. So an outer planet, one of our really slow generational planets, coming into a rare connection to a quick moving planet in your chart. The next type of transit that you might have a little look at would be one from the nodes, where you might look at the North Node in Taurus or the South Node in Scorpio. And here would be looking at conjunctions only. So this applies just if you have any planets or angles in Taurus or Scorpio. So North Node in Taurus could be conjunct Mercury, or conjunct your descendant, or conjunct the Sun in your chart. And that's going to be something that marks 2022 as special and significant for you. We talked about the nodes spending 18 months moving through each pair of signs, but it's actually an 18-year cycle from the last time the North Node was in Taurus to now the North Node being in Taurus again. And so this will be a cycle that you will have had before, but you're not dealing with on a super regular basis. The South Node going through Scorpio, similar thing. If you have any, if you have Venus in Scorpio, or Jupiter in Scorpio, or you have your ascendant in Scorpio, the South Node is going to make a conjunction to that part of your chart this year. It's been 18 years since that last happened, and that is going to be a unique feature of your 2022. So we'll want to make a note of that. I don't have any planets in Scorpio or Taurus, so the nodal transits will just be going through the Scorpio Taurus houses in my chart, which will be a thing, but it won't be on this kind of priority list of unique transits for me for this year. So this would apply, the nodal stuff will apply for those of you who have Scorpio and Taurus placements strong in your chart. Here's a quick chart example, a client example here. We saw this chart a few moments ago when we were looking at the Pluto transit. But in addition to this person having Pluto opposing Mars in their chart, they're also going to have the South Node come over Uranus and the midheaven. Now, I don't do a lot of work with transits to the outer planets in our natal chart. Instead, I look at the outer planets as transiting things that are impacting the chart. So I would see the South Node conjunct Uranus and know that that's a generational thing. And I wouldn't do a lot on interpreting that piece itself. I would be more interested in the transit of the South Node conjunct the midheaven, which is a little bit more of a unique placement in a chart. And the South Node on the midheaven, if we think about the South Node stuff of letting go or endings or release, or highlighting an area in our life that's really draining or depleting us, we could see that this might be a time of downsizing, simplifying, or streamlining in regards to career. We already know major career stuff is on the cards because Pluto is opposing Mars in this chart, Mars being the ruling planet of that Scorpio midheaven. So I would look up in the ephemeris, when is the South Node going to be at 16 degrees of Scorpio, which just off the top of my head is going to be the second half of August. And so that would be an important time for the letting go, that spiritual reprioritization of what's really meaningful rather than what is about chasing worldly ambitions for this individual. So it might be a time of leaving a job, of letting go of some professional responsibilities. Of course, at the same time, we're going to have the North Node on the IC. And so that idea of being hungry to going towards one's home or personal personal life. So it's a real shift in focus here, letting go on the South Node side so that we can create or look to try and accumulate on the North Node IC side. So just to give you an example, and it's been 18 years since that type of cycle has happened. Okay, so we've talked a little bit here about the degrees of Jupiter and Saturn. So what I want to do on this next slide is just to get you to think about how Saturn transits can show up. So just as our next visualized piece. So a transit from Saturn will be most impactful to visible planets other than Saturn. So you could have Saturn to the moon, Saturn to Venus, Saturn to Mars, Saturn to Jupiter is also important. Saturn transits to your natal outer planets, not so much a thing, again, more of a generational trend. So instead, we'd look at Saturn transits to the 6 planets here that move more quickly than Saturn that are also visible planets. Of course, definitely look at Saturn transits to the angles. In the previous chart, let me just bring it back. We have an Aquarius ascendant. So this is going to be a chart that also has Saturn going over the ascendant this year. And we'll have Saturn opposing the moon as well. So there's quite a lot of transit. This is one of those client charts that's going to be very active in 2022. Okay, so let me just bring back this Saturn slide. So just so you can get the visual of what we're looking at, Saturn transits to these quicker moving visible planets or angles. Now, these types of transits happen every 7 years. If we're looking at Saturn conjunct, square, or opposite these quicker moving planets, that is happening on a regular basis. The conjunction is more intense, but you're certainly going to feel the square and the opposition too. So while we might say technically the conjunction is a little more intense, experientially, it's still a big thing whether Saturn is square or opposite or conjunct a planet or angle in your chart. And that will form part of your specific experiences in the year ahead. So you want to be thinking about pivots, about clarifying priorities, about consolidating and reorganizing in a way that cleans things up if you're having a big Saturn transit in the next 12 months. Okay, so let me just do a quick scroll. So I can see some questions in regards to the nodes. So the way that I work with the nodes by timing is primarily to have a look at the transiting nodes impacting the planets or the angles in the birth chart. So I don't do a lot of looking at like a nodal return or the transiting north nodes in Taurus, but your south nodes in Taurus natally. So that's not the way that I work with the nodes by transit. Instead, we're looking at the transiting nodes having an impact on the planets in the chart, the natal houses, or any angles there. So that would be how I would approach those things. So I could see a few questions along those lines. I know that other astrologers will have a different take on that, and they might be able to give more info on transiting node to natal node pieces. But yeah, that's not the framework that I use. So unfortunately, I can't give you a lot on that. Okay, so there's that piece. Saturn transits to Saturn are important, but they're a different type of transit. Then you're getting into the cyclical pieces. So Saturn return or Saturn opposition. And again, what we're trying to do here is have a look at some of these really unique transits that bring out different energetic dynamics into your chart temporarily that are not like what you typically have. And we could certainly argue, transiting Saturn, opposing natal Saturn for sure. It's not the bulk of the type of transit work you do with Saturn, because when you're working with a lot of different clients over wide age ranges, what you will find is, oh, right, you've got your Mercury in the middle of Aquarius, or your Venus is in the middle of Leo, and you're talking a lot more about Saturn's impact on the other planets by transit. So that's part of why I've focused things the way I have today. So just to clarify that, you can certainly look at it, but when I'm thinking about doing a year ahead for a person, these are the things that would come up as most significant. So great. Okay, so we've got a few things And Megan's commenting, plenty of clients fret about their Saturn return coming up. Plenty of clients do fret about that. And sometimes our role as the astrologer is to say, yes, it is important, but actually there's this other thing going on that you might notice more or might be having a bigger impact on you. So, and that will come, partly as you develop your own styles with working with timing as well. Okay. So what I want to do here is just go through 1 or 2 example charts just to have a look at some of the 2020 cycles in play. I know we've covered a lot of theory and dates and details, and sometimes seeing it in action can be helpful. I'm just making sure. I'm going to skip ahead to this particular client chart, which is such an interesting chart. I want to share a little bit about their experiences with the type of things they've got going on. So this chart has the moon at 23 Sag. So it's in the Neptune hotspot degrees for 2022. So Neptune has been squaring the moon. That happened for the first time in the middle of 2021. And Neptune will be coming back to make more squares to the moon in this chart in 2022. We're also going to see transiting Saturn come through and square Venus in this chart, for this particular year. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Yes, transiting Saturn. There's so many things going off next to me here. Saturn is going to square Venus here. Which will be part of their year ahead. Saturn is also going to be squaring the MC-IC axis here. And we will have the South Node going over, excuse my very rudimentary drawing. The South Node is going to go over the midheaven. The North Node will come down and go over Venus. So the moon in this chart is in the 12th house, and it rules or is responsible for managing the topics of the 7th house. And one of the ways this tends to work for people in regards to relationships is it talks about relationships that take you far away from where you started, from your place of origin. This can mean falling in love with someone from a different country or different culture to you. It might talk about meeting someone while you're traveling far away from your home location. It might talk about a relationship that takes you further away from your home location. And this is actually one of those chart stories where the life experiences are maybe a little bit more positive than we might expect, because this person actually got engaged in the middle of 2021 when transiting Neptune was coming through and squaring their moon for the first time. Now, this is a person who was born in North America and has since moved to Europe, where they met their fiancé, their spouse to be. And their spouse to be is from a different part of the world. And as they go forward and contemplate getting married, which they're planning to do in 2022, there's a lot of debate about where they're going to live. And it's quite clear that they won't come back to North America, but there is some question as to whether they will stay in Europe or go to the third other place where their spouse to be is from. And so we can see here that there is some of that kind of more positive side of Neptune, of that feeling of like falling into something or that lovely romantic experience. But we also have the confusion and the uncertainty about doing this thing of getting married and being in this relationship. Where does that lead us to, or where do we end up? And there being a lot of uncertainty about paperwork and visas and where we'll go. We can see that idea of maybe having to let go of some professional aspirations for a period of time so that we can figure out where we're going to be based or anchored in the world, how we're going to prioritize home or having a family, with some of that nodal activity coming through there as well. We're going to have the Saturn square to that midheaven IC axis as well. So we have the nodes transiting the midheaven IC axis and Saturn squaring. So there's a lot of pressure, a lot of competing forces about how to navigate that. And one of the things we talked about when we did our session was the need to kind of take things one step at a time, to do all the official paperwork in the right order and the right process. And how even once we do all that, there might still be a few quirks or uncertainties that are a little out of control. So it's interesting to talk with the client about their experiences and to give some guidance about how to plan or to navigate with the different cycles coming forward. Of course, we can see that even though Uranus won't get to 19 or 20 Taurus this year in 2022, we can see that that's coming in 2023. So that getting things organized paperwork wise this year is not necessarily a guarantee that will be locked in for life, knowing that we've got some of those big change energies coming through still in 2023. So just a little bit of one example there of how we can move through different cycles with a mix of experiences. Let me just do a quick check. Okay, I just want to make sure everything is going good. Okay, so let's look at the chart of Queen Elizabeth. This will probably be our final chart for today. So Queen Elizabeth's had some lots of different transits going on and a few more to come in the year ahead, partly because there are a lot of fixed sign placements in her chart. And so we've had Saturn, of course, going through Aquarius. And in 2021, that Saturn was opposing the moon, which is the ruler of the relationship sector. Now, I wouldn't say this for every client at every stage of life, but when you're talking about a much older individual and their spouse, that would certainly indicate a more serious health event for their spouse. And some of you may or may not know that Queen Elizabeth's husband did pass away in 2021. She's also been dealing with her own health issues, which is a very common Saturn moon transit experience. So for anyone of any age, if Saturn is conjunct, square, or opposing your moon, it's one of those years where we need to get back on track with physical health, self-care. As we look into 2022, we can see that Saturn is going to come up and pass over Mars, Jupiter in this chart. And Mars is important in this chart because it rules the midheaven, if you like, where we have Scorpio here. So that could indicate a fairly significant transition, change, or maybe even the closing down or ending of a cycle regarding one's career. So that's a cycle we can keep an eye on as we go forward into 2022. Okay, so that's just a brief look there. And I think that is all the charts we need to look at. We looked at Adele very briefly. I'm just going to mention some of the other things that are going on. Her chart's going to be very active transit-wise in 2022. So there'll be a fair amount of activity, I imagine, life-wise for her. We looked at the Uranus transits to the Sun, Jupiter, and Mars. We're also going to see Saturn conjunct Mars and then square the Sun, which will be new for 2022. Neptune is going to come in and square Venus in this chart as well. So lots of activity coming forward there. And how would you work with that or interpret that? You would go piece by piece and topic by topic as you interpret those cycles for yourself or for others. In terms of summarizing what we've worked through and had a look at today, so far, your year ahead forecast is helping you highlight or identify the big picture or main transit themes that you may be having. So if you have any planets or angles in Pisces or the early part of Aries, you'll now know that you're going to have Jupiter conjunct those planets or angles in Pisces and Jupiter conjunct those planets or angles between 0 and 8 Aries. You may still be trying to make sense of what it might mean, and we'll flesh those things out partly in the Q&A. You'll have a chance to review some things via the reading and in our ongoing discussion. You'll also have some knowledge about any nodal transits that you might be having to planets between 29 or 11 degrees of Taurus and Scorpio. And if you want to get really specific about the exact months, I tend to use a really tight 0-degree orb for transit. So I want to know exactly when is that transiting Jupiter or nodes or other planet making the direct aspect to my natal thing. And so do use your ephemeris or your astrology software to check that out. You'll know that Saturn is going to be covering from 11 to 25 degrees in Aquarius, which is going to affect any of your fixed signs, planets, or angles in those same degrees. Uranus is going to be activating the fixed signs as well. So planets or angles between 10 and 18 degrees of the fixed signs are getting Uranus. Neptune is triggering from 20 to 25 Pisces. And that will affect planets from 20 to 25 of Gemini, Virgo, or Sagittarius as well. And Pluto, very briefly at 25 degrees at the start of the year, but primarily activating planets at 26, 27, and 28 degrees of the cardinal signs. So as I mentioned at the start, not all of these will apply to you, but the ones that do are going to have a huge impact on defining the current and the topics and the tone of energy that you're exploring and expressing in the year ahead. So team, that is it for our first class here today. There are some reflection worksheets that will be posted for you so that you can sit down and just make some notes and reflections about how this is affecting your chart. And if you get stuck on any of the technique, we'll be in the discussion forum after class over the next week or so, and also in the Q&A session on Thursday if we need to go forward with anything more. So let me just double check with Larry and Michael if there's any questions that we should have a look at before we finish. This question here I see. Anastasia's asking, could you talk about Saturn in Aquarius in 2022 without Jupiter being there? That's a great question. So Jupiter has a little bit of a protective influence. And so if you've been doing some Saturn transits in 2021 and Jupiter has been there, it's not that they're softened, but you may have been able to find your way through with just a tiny bit of extra ease. In 2022, we're kind of back to normal Saturn transit territory because it is more normal to have a Saturn transit without Jupiter being involved. And so we're kind of back on track. I guess 2021 Saturn's transits were a little bit of an anomaly. They may have been a little bit easier. I'm not necessarily sure that's true, but I think in 2022, it's like this is usual Saturn stuff. So it's a little bit, it might feel weightier. You might feel like you really have to do your research and be very thorough. And you might feel like there isn't any let up, if you like. One of the things I'm really excited about for 2022 is that while we still have to do some of that kind of grinding, effortful managing and organizing of stuff around our Aquarius house and topics, Jupiter is kind of free to do its own thing in Pisces and then in Aries. So for the first time in a couple of years, Jupiter is not bound or constrained by Saturn. And so that brings back, if you like, into our astrological experience, a quality of Jupiter, whether it's a stretching out, whether it's a growing, or whether it's a being able to connect with a hopeful or optimistic mindset. We haven't had Jupiter offering that for a couple of years. So I don't necessarily think so to the direct question about Saturn, it's just like, okay, now we're back to regular Saturn transits. But I think that the counterbalance is that in a different part of our lives, Jupiter is actually bringing some forward perspective, some growth, some enrichment, some nourishment, which may not change what you're dealing with your Saturn transit, but can help us hold things into an appropriate perspective so that we're not so all consumed by the Aquarius part of our chart and we can have a little bit more variety there. So hopefully that helps answer that. The Jupiter-Neptune cycle, in terms of how that affects the collective, that will be more of a discussion for another day. What we're really focused on here is how that's going to kind of really flesh out the Neptune transits that you might be having and the month in 2022 to really be experiencing that. It'll be a flood. It could be a flood of feeling or inspiration or a flood of emotion that needs to pour out of you. We're going to see a lot of that active in April of 2022. It is a very rare combination to have Jupiter and Neptune together. So again, it's one of those anomalies where if you are having a Neptune transit in 2022, it's a little bit more of a helping factor to it that isn't normally present. So that will be a little bit of a special blessing, I think, for Neptune transits in 2022 specifically. Okay. So then I can see some of the questions are getting into more specific iterations. And I think the best place to talk about those will either be in the discussion forum, where we can kind of dive into it, and where that'll also be a great place to share some of your stories, and in the Q&A, the live Q&A coming up later this week. So hopefully that helps clarify all of those pieces. There is some, I think there was a question about people wanting readings. So I personally am not taking new client consults. I've got a full client roster. And so 2022 is pretty much spoken for me for clients. But I know that I think, and Larry and Michael will correct me, but I think both Larry and Michael have some openings for new clients. So definitely connect with them. You can ask them in the discussion forum or reach out to them through their websites as well. There's lots of info. And if you've not had a live timing reading with a professional astrologer before, it will be so helpful for yourself personally to guide you through the year ahead, but also for you developing your own practice and your own style, just to have that experience of what is it like to receive this information, and also how is it that other astrologers set this type of session up. So I would highly recommend both Larry and Michael if that's something that you're looking for. Yes, and Demetra is no longer taking clients either. So yes, Larry and Michael would be my recommendations. Okay, so I think we have caught up there. Yes, it isn't possible to cover every iteration of every transit because we'd be here for a week. So if we looked at Saturn transiting every planet and then Uranus transiting every planet, or the nodes transiting every planet, but the intention in a training course like this is actually to give you the keywords and concepts for the transiting bodies, with an expectation that you will already have some keywords and concepts for the natal chart. And so that part of your work in developing your own practice and integration is to start putting the two together. The worksheets will help you have a go at applying this. And if you get stuck, we'll see you in the discussion forum or in the live Q&As for more. All right, team, that's it from us for today. I will see you all again in class next week, but before then on Thursday in the Q&As if you can make it. Thank you all so much. I'm going to give